And with that, to get us started and inspired, I am very delighted to introduce Joy Bailey Bryant, U.S. President of Lord Cultural Resources. Joy is an international leader recognized for her work with cities, communities, and institutions around arts and culture and storytelling. She has specialized in the development of identity museums, specifically focusing on Black history and Black culture, creating environments where people are engaged in telling and interpreting their own stories. Joy has worked with prestigious and well-known institutions such as the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., the National September 11 Memorial and Museum, and here in Georgia, the expansion of the Albany Civil Rights Institute in Albany, Georgia, which honors the stories of the Southwest Georgia Civil Rights Movement. As a new director of arts and culture here at SGA, I'm thrilled that Joy will be delivering our first keynote and setting the tone for the entire Equity Summit. I believe that culture and the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and our places have tremendous power to shape the contours of every aspect of our lives, and that advancing equity through our work requires telling, listening to, elevating, and honoring different stories and different storytellers. Joy was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, which is where I currently live. Joy, it's an honor to introduce you today.
Thank you so much. And it's so wonderful to be here with you, Marianne. And thank you for this invitation. As Marianne said, I'm Joy Bailey Bryant, president of the U.S. company of Lord Cultural Resources. And it's just such an honor to talk about this amazing opportunity that we have as planners, developers, smart workers, just people who are existing in this space to make the world a better, more equitable place through all of the tools that are in our toolkit, of which arts and culture is one of the strongest. Isn't that why we're here today? It's because of the opportunity to change the world and make it a better place. The inspiration for this talk comes from work that I've been doing for a while, finding ways to use the spaces, memories, and yes, objects and places for liberation, civil rights, justice, and peace, to invite people into public spaces, publicly created spaces to improve our world today. So let's begin with our conversation. So let's go to the next slide. I always start our conversations, my conversations, anywhere there's a discussion, with a land acknowledgement, because it's important to think about others outside of ourselves. In this moment, I encourage you to acknowledge the presence of the people who came before you, wherever you are. I acknowledge the presence of the historic and heritage people on the lands of the Lenape people, where I have my office in New York City. I am excited to ask you to share in the chat some of the locations of the historic and heritage people's lands on which you might be sitting today. We do this in our work because a lot of the work that we're doing is not just about ourselves and our stories. It's about the stories of others, Black and Brown people, unrecognized histories. So I welcome the opportunity. Please do share the names of some of the, either it could be tribal lands that you may be on, but the historic and heritage lands, the names, call those names from which you are, on which you are. Next slide. Just to talk about the role of culture in building cities, one of the things is we were talking about what would be important to communicate about culture and really thinking through how culture helps us to build cities. You might have heard of the triple bottom line of culture. I posit that there's a quadruple bottom line. The first three is that the first part is that culture actually makes a place a place. It's what makes my hometown and Marion's hometown of Atlanta different from where I am now today, New York. What makes it different from Patna, India, which I'll talk about later in this conversation. It makes the place real. All of those items that you think about, if you think about Chicago, you might think about what we call the bean, which is, Cloud Gate. We think about these types of places because of arts and culture, iconic arts and culture. The next part about arts and culture that really helps us to think about it and makes culture really build cities is that it educates us. It helps us to build 21st century skills. And by that, I mean, culture helps us to adapt when we are thinking about and utilizing, arts and culture, learning more about different peoples, learning more about different heritage. It helps us to expand our mind. There are all kinds of different studies that help us to see and understand that culture puts us in a better place. It opens our mind, and the more exposure that we have to culture, it's a muscle. It helps us to build our synapses in our brain. So that's part two. And part three is this part about the economic generator. It attracts the best and brightest. If you think about, if you're ever trying to attract a company to a city, if you're ever trying to attract workers into your jobs or your company, they're often wondering, what are the cultural aspects? What type of heritage, what types of stories, what types of investment and engagement am I going to be able to get into in these different places? It's a draw. Culture is a draw. And as a result of that, it increases property values. And it also helps with, it's a tourism generator as well. So that's an economic generator. Now, one of the things that happens in that economic generation is that kind of yin and yang of what we call gentrification or displacement, right? You elevate a place so far that, and property values have gone up so far that it then displaces the cultural aspects of people who made the place what they were in the first place. So as a result of that, what we have is what we've started to do is called place keeping, where we're preserving the culture while promoting the culture. So it's both promoting and preserving the culture. And that is a real job and a real opportunity that we have as policymakers and planners. This is our opportunity to foster equity. This is where that big opportunity lies for us. To utilize arts and culture, not just as a draw, but a maintainer, a way to keep people in the spaces in which they have made these places valuable and will generate even more value, but also keep them in their homes and in their neighborhoods. Next slide. So just to tell you a little bit about Lord Cultural Resources, we are a consulting firm that works with communities. We work with museums, parks, gardens, libraries, developers. We do cultural plans, really to help to sustain the museums and parks and gardens, to help them to be sustainable places that attract people and organizations to the neighborhood and preserves that culture, okay? So really helping to ensure that we are not displacing individuals, as I always talk about in neighborhoods. We're instead revitalizing neighborhoods, and we're really creating bigger opportunities through business plans and strategic plans, really harnessing the investments, public investments. One of the big things that we do is we ensure that underrepresented stories are told. Marion mentioned that I worked with the Albany Civil Rights Institute in Albany, Georgia. that was telling the stories of the African-American civil rights movement. In the late 2000s, I was working on that museum, but these were stories from the 30s, 40s, and 50s that had never been told, had never been given value. And as a result, the neighborhoods were being bulldozed and the histories were being erased. So the work that we do in these places is really preserving this culture, really using arts and culture as an opportunity to make people feel more pride in their homes, staying in their spaces, and really creating these opportunities for new community, for communities to regenerate themselves. Next slide. So I put this slide in here because it's important for us to think about what culture was and why it's important in this movement. At one point in time, culture was, it was that thing that came from on high, right? There's a concept of hard power, where people would go into different countries and steal your items, right? We talk about the Elgin marbles. Why were they called Elgin? That was because Lord Elgin went into a location and removed these friezes that told a story of these people and took that and put it into a museum. And that museum then was on a hill and charged and said, this is the power that I have over peoples of the land, of the earth. I have hard military power. I can take your items, I can put them into a museum, and I can charge you to come see your own items. Now that we are in a space recognizing that colonialist way of being, and recognizing that doesn't work, right? We have had the uprising and the understanding that now we have to be of demand. We have to be a more collaborative space. So in museums where I work a lot, we have to be collaborative in telling our stories. We have to return those items to the appropriate places, to the people whose stories need to be told. When we're working in indigenous places, we need to call those names. We need to care for the people, not just the objects with whom we are working. We have to be anti-racist. All of these things are important, and they're actually important as we think about planning, because when we understand that arts and culture, again, is a tool that we have in our quiver to improve our neighborhoods and to make people feel more welcome, that we can through the stories that we tell. If I'm sharing a story from an indigenous culture, I'm not going to share it myself. I'm actually going to give the floor to that indigenous person, to those indigenous cultures who do still exist. They are not historical peoples. That we are able to create more space in those lands. Next slide. So all of this is to say that arts and culture makes public space more public. And by that, let me just talk a little for a second. The opportunity to create a space that welcomes everyone in. If you think about the public spaces that we have, what are they called? Privately owned public spaces, POPs. Oftentimes, when we create these beautiful places, we might go out to them and they are empty. But what makes them truly public is when we have a festival, when we have a public art, when we have some type of experience that welcomes people into the spaces. And imagine when you diversify the experiences of those festivals, the experiences of that public art. How does that change the complexion and the feeling of welcome that you have in those public spaces? So that puts forward something for us when we're trying to make a decision about how we are going to make those public spaces truly, truly public. How do we invite arts and culture in? There's three questions that we really need to ask ourselves. Next slide. It's pretty simple. It's who decides, who pays, and who benefits. So when we think about who decides, it's who's at the table at the start of the conversation, right? You all know about this. We're planners. We're the people who come to the table together to talk about what's going to be included, what are we going to have in these spaces, right? And what's important from day one is who is sitting around that table. So when we talk about equitable delivery, it's equity across all lenses. And especially when we're thinking about arts and culture, think about who you want to enjoy this space, okay? So then we're thinking about who's paying. So those who pay aren't just paying money. They're really going to be experiencing a cost of their time and their effort and their energy. So who is paying for this space? And then we think about the ultimate, right? Who benefits? And that's what you see the evidence of. So it's not just talking about who's benefiting financially. This is the people who are getting what they want, and getting this really, this is an asset to them. So I actually want to give some credit here. This policy link, I mean, obviously these are not original questions, but I will say policy link, from whom I borrowed these questions, talks about this from a transportation lens. So Calvin was speaking about this earlier. When you think about people of color, especially African Americans and Latinos, together make up the majority of public transportation users in most urban areas. And if you think about the fact that transportation investments are traditionally benefiting people who drive cars. So then you have an inequity, right? So there's an inequity in who is benefiting. So if we think about, we want to correct that benefit, let's apply this to culture, okay? So the National Endowment for the Arts longitudinal study that it's been doing for about 20 years now tells us that though African Americans, Black and Latino people, Black and Brown people in the US are not traditional museum, opera, ballet, symphony, it's called the Big Four, users, people of color, Blacks and Latinos outpace all other races in their attendance of festivals, live cultural events, and their use of public parks, and yes, spaces of worship. So this is all cultural places and people. So let's just talk about really quickly. I'm going to try and run quickly. I see the time is moving very fast for me. I'm going to just talk about a few examples of what this can mean. So let's go to the next slide. So here we have 3 examples of in the Hudson Yards, the High Line, and Metro Tech in New York. So these are all in one city. When we think about who benefits from Hudson Yards, if you know Hudson Yards, it is a space, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it. It is a space that is really developed by the wealthiest high net worth people. It benefits some of the wealthiest people, but it also has the wealthiest people paying. So that's kind of at the far end of the spectrum. In the middle, you have the High Line, which is also connected to Hudson Yards. The High Line is almost a 2-mile long elevated linear park. It is a space that is developed, and very high net worth individuals were sitting at the table for the decision makers for the High Line, but also there were some more equitable. There was kind of a scaling of who should come, who should benefit from this High Line New York space. That resulted in the development of the Friends of the High Line, which we'll talk a little bit about later. As a result of that, the people who benefit from the High Line, you can see across the board, you'll see all kinds of people, diversity of economics, age, gender. You have all kinds of people gathering on the High Line, so that mid-space area. And then on the other end of the spectrum is Metro Tech, which is in Brooklyn. And Metro Tech is really something that was redeveloped in 2018, but it's an older space that was a cluster of university buildings and kind of a not really an active space. In 2018, the place was redeveloped, and at the table you had public and private universities. You had public services like the fire department, the police department. You had offerings, banks, public schools. You have all types of spaces in there. And the redevelopment of Metro Tech, and now called Brooklyn Commons, allows for beautiful park spaces, public art, which welcomes in public art, which is developed by a diversity of artists. So that gives you that spectrum. Let's talk about who decides on a bigger scale. Next slide. And actually, if you can move quickly, I'm gonna go to yes. So here I skimmed over the Highline model because I wanted to talk just a little bit about, this is both a nonprofit and a public park, and it creates the opportunity, as I said, with the incorporation of public art and public programs run by a multitude of different organizations. So the arts and public programming, arts and creative programming at the Highline regularly partners with organizations like Rennie Harris Dance Movement, which is an African-American dance company. Regularly, the Highline had Rick House, which was Simone Lee's major winner of the Golden Goose Prize at the Venice Biennale just recently. First time an African-American woman won that award. So the incorporation of these, I'm just giving you two examples, but the incorporation of these kind of large public art opportunities allows for the integration, that's an old word, but the integration of different types of people of all kinds. So next slide. I included the Louvre Abu Dhabi because I wanted to show that when you think about who decides, again, a very wealthy example, this is a mixed commercial, residential, and leisure project that's developed by the Abu Dhabi Tourism Authority. And the decisions were made by a master plan that was developed. And there's going to be 8 different museums on this space. But this is like at the height, right? When we're talking about who is deciding. So you have that juxtaposition between the Highline, which is really trying to create more of an integration of different types of people. But the Saadiyat Island idea, which is this larger development, is still trying to find its footing and it is actually thinking more about equity in its development because it is doing outreach to different countries based on, and this is an interesting fact, it is actually thinking through the people from Saadiyat Island, the people from Abu Dhabi Tourism Authority recognize that internationally they are making changes to be more equitable in their outreach and development of spaces like this. Go to the next slide of who pays. So when we think about who is paying for what's happening. Next slide. I'm showing this from Colorado. The state of Colorado has, and it has a voluntary kind of opt-in opportunity for public art. So a lot of you all might know about the Percent for Art programs across the country. The first of which were implemented in San Francisco, for instance, and it creates, in many places, creates this fund that really allows for art to be public art of all types, not just static public art, but public art that can be expressed here. You see the dairy block, mixed use redevelopment creates an opportunity for all types of people to be engaged in these different spaces. So when you think about redevelopment and equitable redevelopment, the incorporation of artists of all ethnicities and races in the dairy block is really a huge recognition in changing this place from what it was it was not a place that was really drawing people in. And now it is drawing people of different ethnicities and making people to feel welcome. This space here, as you can see, looks very active and really pulls people in. So I'm just trying to really communicate that art and culture creates a welcoming place, and you can use this kind of public dollars, private dollars to create an opportunity to make your places more equitable and more welcoming. Next slide. So then, you know, I've put here Wynwood, which is a real classic example in Miami of artwork really helping to redevelop a place and to make a place just one of the most fun environments, right? So here you have high-end residential developers incorporate significant artworks in lobbies and public spaces to sell, right? That's true. But also we have opportunities to create opportunities of just fun, right? So I'm going to skip all the way down to the Museum of Ice Cream with interactive art exhibits. These are all places. This is just really how culture draws in all types of people. And this is also talking about who's paying, but look at the results, what types of people we end up attracting. The Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, which is the next slide, is talking, the Lucas Museum is a place that is being developed about 1 million square feet of space that includes a parking garage, a parkland, a museum, exhibitions and theaters. The majority of the funding for the Lucas Museum is being supplied by George Lucas and Melody Hobson. And this museum is being developed as a extremely equitable space it's being paid for by George Lucas and Melody Hobson, but its edict is that it has a mandate to allow for experiences of particularly Black and Brown people in its stories of narrative art. For example, the acquisition of George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware, but George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware, if you remember, and that's a Robert Colescott piece that is a take on the Gilbert Stuart piece of George Washington crossing the Delaware. So the Lucas Museum acquired the George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware piece, and that will be a centerpiece of one of the exhibitions in this space. And this is an illustration, again, of a place that is a major development. It's transforming. You can see from that image, it is transforming that neighborhood. If you're driving down the 405, it's transforming the texture and the feel of this place. And this place is telling and sharing and incorporating equitable stories. The parklands will be filled with public art by a diversity of different types of artists, and public art gatherings by diversity of arts organizations. So this is another illustration of who is paying, but then thinking about who the George Lucas and Melody Hobson, who will benefit. The public will benefit, and this will be an equitable, beautiful space. Next slide. So when we think about who is benefiting, I spoke a little bit at the beginning about the creative place keeping, and that the kind of trauma, the tension that happens between when a artist and arts organizations come into spaces and make those spaces which were considered undesirable for whatever reasons, and they help to regenerate interest in those areas. At one point in time, we call that place making, but place making is really when somebody comes in from the outside, but place keeping is when something is preserved just because it is there. It is generative of that place. So this active care and maintenance of a place by the people who live and work there. It is really important when we're thinking about, especially I mentioned indigenous cultures before, but thinking about indigenous architects and planners who are really saying we are not historical people. We are people who are here today, and we have to protect our land and our places. We see this in Black-led spaces, in Black-led neighborhoods. We see this in brown, brown Latina, Latinx areas and Hispanic heritage areas. It is really important when we think about creative place keeping that we enable people in those places to stay in those places. So when we're thinking about who's benefiting that creative place keeping, arts and culture is very much a part of that. It's a part of the instilling pride as well. So let's talk about the next slide. So the Bihar Museum is in Patna, India. Patna, India is actually the poorest province in India, and the development of the Bihar Museum is one of the newest. It actually just fully opened in this last year. And in 2015, the Children's Museum, which is that image you see on the right, opened. And the importance of the Bihar Museum is that it is a beautiful space that is telling a story of a people who have been traditionally considered the workers of the world. So the people of Patna often are the ones who are the workers at in Abu Dhabi, are the workers in Singapore. The people in Patna are the people who are the backbone many times of a lot of the work that is happening, the laborers in India. This museum is telling their story from their voice, using their voice. So it's a place of pride. We have seen in the areas surrounding the Bihar Museum and the people coming in, the numbers of the people who are economically disadvantaged who visit the Bihar Museum are just astronomical, and they have all types of programs on a daily basis to welcome people who live in the area, live in that province, to ensure that they know their stories and have pride in their stories. Okay, so that said, I believe I'm at the last two. I do want to go to the beacon. I just wanted to show you this image. This is a parking garage in San Jose, outside of San Jose Airport, just to show you the way that arts and culture, again, is a tool. These are multicultural hands that in the image is, the piece is called hands. The hands are Black and brown people, white people, all ethnicities, and you can see the evidence of this, and it's lit up at night as well. It's the idea is that art is medicine, and art can be a catalyst for change. And this draws people in as the airport is a place that, depending on your experience, it can be pretty dismal. But this one is one where we're developers and people who have talked about the space, they talk about how they enjoy going past this. It makes them feel better. It improves their kind of spirits when they're thinking about, or when they pass this space. So this is another, and it also, because of the multiculturalness of it, it helps people to know you are welcome here. Next slide, last one. So I just showed this last slide because it shows that arts and culture draws people to public spaces, yes, but there's a multitude over time of ways that arts and culture can really, from Spiral Jetty, the 1970 piece, all the way through the Black Lives Matter Plaza, that really is in Washington, D.C. and has been a catalyst and a draw for so many. and really the idea that that welcomes, this space feels welcoming, right? It feels like, because it says Black Lives Matter, that people of different Black and brown people are welcome. Look at this city dance in San Jose. It's an annual public art evening of music and open air dance. This happens often, all the time. And then finally, this last piece that was actually recently removed of the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond, Virginia. First, you see how it's been, how the graffiti painting on it, but then it was finally removed. So you see the way that public art and arts and culture can change or shape the way that people think about public spaces. And that's really important when you think about your jobs as planners. How are we making our places more welcoming, more equitable? And what are we doing when we create these tables of who decides, who pays, and who benefits? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joy. That was so wide-ranging and so fascinating that I just loved hearing you talk about all of that. I think we have maybe some space and maybe some time for one question. So, you come from a background and you have extensive training and years of experience in arts and culture. And I was just, fascinated to hear that your introduction to planning, the planning that so many of the people in the audience and practitioners in the audience, that kind of planning really came through the process of doing your work. And, since one of our goals for the Equity Summit is people leaving with actionable steps, I think your 3 questions that you asked were really helpful for that. But do you have any more specific thoughts for our audience members, who might not have arts and culture training and background, but are really seeking to find inspiration and intersections with arts and culture to bring into their work? Do you have any recommendations for how to even start doing that?
Yes.
Or dive in further?
Yes, thank you so much. So I will tell you the question that someone put in the chat about speaking more about community engagement. One of the things that I do is community engagement at the start, right? The conversation, immediately welcoming people to the table, that setting the table for who decides is so important and is so real in making sure that you're looking around at the people who are your communities. And I always talk about communities as communities of practice and communities of place. So it's the people who are walking around outside of your doors and the people who are engaged or affiliated with you in some way or should be. So when you're thinking about your communities of place, there's a lot of museums, a lot of parks and gardens, especially where you have the pay spaces, right? And even some parks where people say, why are we not seeing the people who live in this area enjoying this space? And the real answer to the question is ask them. Yeah. So, right, I can posit all kinds of things as to why, maybe your heels are too high, who knows? But I'm going to ask those people who are living in that area, who through my demographic research, and some of this is just sheer the things that planners do very well, looking at the demographics of who is in an area and why, and then start to have those conversations. We've had conversations. I was working with a client at one point in time, and we had, and out in New York, I live in New York, we would have dinners at Mana's, which is a it's kind of a open buffet type of place, and we would give people 1 meal ticket and we would say, hey, for a meal, can you sit down with us and talk about what you would like to see in your neighborhood museum? What stories would you like to have to engage with in these places? What would ensure, what would make you cross the threshold? So having those conversations in places where people feel welcome is inherently more equitable than saying, oh, you've got to come to me all the time.
I love that. And I was just thinking, when you were mentioning that Black and Latino community members or audiences may not, be going to the places where we think of as traditional arts and culture institutions, but that their attendance far outpaces attendance of festivals or public parks far outpaces the general population. And I was just thinking that too, in my community, like the parking lot is the place of gathering or the place of street vending, informal commercial activity. And so, we have to think of our public spaces may not be traditional public spaces. So, well, thank you so much. I know our time was too short, as always, because I think we could have spent 2 more hours here with you, but thank you so much for joining us.
Can I answer
yes,
one last question here?
Yes, absolutely.
How do you go back to the table when or reset the table? It's about trust building, right? So people always say, okay, how do you build trust? You build trust by going, first of all, you start conversations that going out to where people are, as opposed to, well, you're definitely welcoming them into your space, but don't expect that people are going to want to come into your space all the time. You have to go out to where they are. And it's that 5 cups of tea kind of opportunity where you're continuously having conversations with people. And then there's a little bit of apology. You have to actually acknowledge, well, I know that this happened, and and for whatever reason, and you speak to that, speak directly to the elephant in the room, as we say, call out the fact that something was not done correctly. You weren't invited to the table. We want you at the table, and then continuously have show ways that you're making changes based on the things that people tell you. So that resetting the table is an active circular piece.
That's so great. Thank you. And we have to keep moving. So we've been taking lots of notes, and any questions that we didn't have time for, we will follow up with on our blog, our newsletter and discussion guides. So we're going to take a very brief break. And please feel free to stick around. It'll probably be a 5-minute break. It will be a 5-minute break, and we'll be sharing a presentation on Black ghost towns, which is telling the stories of Black communities that have been destroyed by land use planning, such as through the construction of public parks, lakes, and reservoirs. So we'll be back in 5 minutes. Thank you. Thanks, Joy.
Thank you.